Next, we'll look at economic growth in the United States. So we'll use the history of the experience of the United States to help us understand how capital accumulation and how technological change helps drive economic growth. So prior to the year 1900 in the United States, growth rates were relatively modest. There wasn't a ton of industrialization, and there was not a lot of growth, year to year. But during the Industrial Revolution, the U.S. firms increased the quantity of capital per hours worked, so they were increasing their capital stock. And new technologies like the steam engine, the railroad, the telegraph also became available and were over time widely adopted. So together, these factors resulted in a growth rate of real GDP per worker of 1.3% from 1800 to 1900. So at this low level of growth, real GDP per capita would double about every 63 years. So that means living standards were growing steadily but relatively slowly. Now, by the 20th century, the US went from adopting technologies that were invented in other countries to doing the inventing themselves. And this technological change became institutionalized. So many of the large corporations that were forming at this time created research and development facilities in order to improve the quality of their products and the efficiency with which they produce them so they could produce more or make them at a lower cost. Universities began to conduct research that had business applications and things that were relevant for the real world. After World War II, many firms began to provide significant funds to universities to help pay for that research. And in 1950, the federal government created the National Science Foundation, whose main goal is to support university researchers. Now, this accelerating rate of technological change led to more rapid growth rates. So we see from 1950 to 1973, the average rate of growth of GDP per hour worked rose to 2.6%. And after a slowdown from the mid-70s to the 90s of 1.5%, which was still above the 1800s, we got back to 2.4% for a decade from the mid-90s to the mid-2000s. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, the growth rate in the United States accelerated over time, rather than slowing down and experiencing those diminishing returns. Then, suddenly, in the mid-1970s, the unexpected happened. For about 2 decades, from 1974 to 1995, the growth rate of real GDP per hour worked slowed. The growth rate during these years was more than 1 percentage point per year lower than during the previous 2 decades. Now, some economists argue that there wasn't really a slowdown in economic growth that we experience at this time. That is just an appearance from the data because of how we measure growth. So in the 1970s to the 1990s, most of the growth in output that we experienced came in the form of services rather than from goods. So improvements in services come mostly through quality differences, and that's really hard to measure for services than it is for goods. Much more difficult to measure and to compare the quality over time for services. And this is a much more optimistic view. An alternative argument, more of a pessimistic view, is that America concentrated more on quality of life issues, things like health and safety and environmental regulations, and a change in educational focus. Think of the 1970s, if you were alive for then or if you've driven those old cars, how much safer cars got from the 1970s to the 1990s. So a lot of our focus, rather than just improving output or productivity, was improving safety, which is still great for how people live, but in terms of if we're looking at GDP per hour worked, like those growth rates, then it's not going to be as good. What we saw was other high-income countries experience similarly timed slowdowns in productivity. So the US wasn't doing something uniquely counterproductive at this time. There was something else going on for all these countries. So from 1996 to 2014, we've experienced another period of high productivity growth and high GDP per hour worked growth. So some examples of the new technologies that help drive this are faster data processing, like computers, better communication, like cell phones and the internet, that businesses were able to adopt to make themselves much more productive. So business record keeping, which was once, done by hand, is now done much more quickly and accurately by computers using Excel. The amount of time it takes to keep track of those records is much, much less now than it was years in the past. These have made businesses more productive and allowed them to cut costs in ways that they weren't able to in the past. Now, some economists argue that changes in the quality of services have been particularly important over the past decade and a half. So again, we've seen this lower GDP growth from 2006 to the current day. So they think some of the cause of this is, again, a renewed increase in services rather than in new technologies being adopted. Remember, from 96 to like 2006, in that decade, where again we saw a rebound in productivity growth, it's being led due to the internet being widely adopted by firms for the first time. Now that the internet has been adopted, now that we have this faster data processing, we're only seeing smaller improvements from that. And most of the improvements that we're seeing in productivity or in quality are coming from services again. So again, GDP growth is being understated compared to the actual growth of the economy. But some economists are concerned that we're going to experience this slower growth we've seen over the past decade or so last even longer and into the future. So recently, Harvard economist Larry Summers talked about this. George Mason economist Tyler Cowen has written about it. Nobel laureate Paul Krugman wrote about it 25 years ago. But the idea of secular stagnation dates back to the late 1930s. Towards the end of the Great Depression, Harvard economist Alvin Hansen predicted that the U.S. economy would experience an extended period of slow growth, which he called secular stagnation. Now later we saw rapid growth rates for the U.S. economy, proving that his theory was wrong at the time. And as they say, history may not exactly repeat itself, but they reboot the franchise every so often. So the current theory of secular stagnation is that slowing population growth is going to reduce the demand for housing. We'll see modern IT firms that require less capital than old firms, and the price of capital has fallen relative to other goods. So as a consequence of little need for capital, Larry Summers expects the rate of investment to stay low. What Paul Krugman focused on with his idea of secular stagnation is we're going to see lower growth rates because we have so much of our economy based on services rather than manufacturing. And it's much more difficult to improve productivity in giving services. What Tyler Cowen focuses on is a lack of new ideas, a lack of technological improvements. Because people are more risk averse, they don't want to spend a lot of money on research and development. They don't want to take the risks of being an entrepreneur. And in many ways, we're trying to prevent the creative destruction from happening. Many economies try to prevent old industries from being killed by new upstarts because of the resulting loss in jobs and the pain in the interim until we reach, the mature new industry to fill all the jobs that had been lost by the previous industry dying. Now, there are a lot of critics of this idea. George Selgin laughs about it and says, hey, this happens every decade. Someone says we're going to have low growth, and they're always proved wrong. Other critics of this idea say that investment has been low because of the severity of the recession from 2007 and 2009. And we've seen increasing costs because of new regulatory policy in the aftermath of the Great Recession. And that soon it's going to bounce back once firms are able to account for these new increasing labor costs and increasing regulatory costs that we hadn't seen before. So now in section 4, we're going to ask the question, why isn't the whole world rich? So we're going to look between countries and see what's going on. And we'll explain catch-up growth. See why countries have experienced it and why some countries have not experienced it. So the solo growth model, this economic growth model that we've been working with early on in the chapter, predicts that poor countries are going to grow faster than rich countries. And remember, this is because the effect of additional capital is greater for countries with smaller capital stocks. When you have very little capital, it causes much greater productivity gains than when you have quite a bit of capital. And there are greater advances in technology that are immediately available to poorer countries that they can take advantage of right away from research and development going on in other more advanced economies. So if poor countries grow faster than rich countries, they're going to start to catch up, or they're going to do what we call converge to the richer countries. So this idea of convergence, this idea of catch-up, is a prediction that the level of GDP per capita in poor countries will grow faster than in rich countries. So if we look at the graph on the right, we have the growth in real GDP per capita and the initial level of real GDP per capita. So because rich countries have a very high initial level of real GDP per capita, we expect them to have very little growth. They're much lower growth because of this inverse relationship between the two. Likewise, poorer countries that start out with a much lower level of real GDP per capita should experience a much higher growth rate in real GDP per capita. If we look at high-income countries, we appear to see strong evidence of this catch-up hypothesis. So we can see convergence across these high-income countries. So countries like Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, and Hong Kong that had the lowest incomes in the 1960s grew at the fastest rate between 1960 and 2014. And countries like Switzerland, New Zealand, and the US that had the highest incomes in 1960, they grew the slowest. So we saw that for high-income countries since the 1960s, it's pretty much conformed to our very simple figure on the previous slide of that catch-up line. Which if catch-up was occurring, that's what should be happening, and that's what we saw happened. But while we've had convergence big time among the high-income countries, we've not seen that across all the countries. In fact, most of the world hasn't been catching up. So if we expand our analysis for every country, which we have statistics available for, it becomes much more difficult to find this catch-up growth that's been predicted by Solow's growth model. So if we look at the data for 111 countries between 1960 and 2014, we don't see this consistent relationship of real GDP per capita. So some countries that had low levels of real GDP per capita in 1960, like Niger and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, actually experienced negative economic growth. So they had lower levels of real GDP per capita in 2014 than they did in 1960. Other countries that started with a low level of real GDP per capita, like Malaysia and China, grew rapidly. And some middle-income countries in 1960, like Jamaica, grew very slowly between 1960 and 2014, while others like Ireland grew much more rapidly. Not only have we not seen some of the low-income countries converge like we expected them to, other high-income countries have stopped catching up to the United States. So this figure on the slide shows the real GDP per capita for these countries relative to the United States' real GDP per capita. They show 1990 and then 2014. So the blue bar shows these nations, their percentage of GDP compared to the United States GDP in 1990, and then the red shows it in 2014. So in each of these cases, for the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Japan, and Canada, they initially were around, most of them were around 80% of the US real GDP per capita in 1990. But by 2014, each of them had fallen. So why are these countries not catching up to the United States? There's several reasons that can explain this. The first is the flexibility of the US labor market. So the US labor markets are far more flexible labor markets in many other countries. And this because of this for several reasons. So often in European countries, government regulations make it much more difficult for firms to fire workers, and thereby make firms reluctant to hire workers in the first place. So as a result, we see many young workers that have extreme difficulty in finding jobs. And once a job is found, a worker tends to remain in it, even if their skills are a mismatch or their preferences aren't a good fit for the characteristics of the job. This is particularly true in countries like Spain and France, where you see youth unemployment rates up as high as 30%. On the other hand, in the US, government regulations are far less restrictive. It's much more easy to fire workers and for workers to choose to leave and for workers to get hired. Because workers have an easier time finding jobs, workers change jobs fairly frequently. And this high rate of job mobility ensures a much better match between workers' skills and their preferences and the characteristics of the job. So this ends up increasing labor productivity because it increases our matches. We have much higher quality matches between workers and the jobs they work. Many European countries also have restrictive work rules that what they do in effect is limit the ability of firms to implement new technologies. These rules restrict the tasks that firms can ask workers to perform and the hours that they work. It's very annoying for us to get work emails outside of working hours in the United States. And because of that, it's banned in many European countries. But sometimes these questions are necessary. Sometimes there's things that, they're emergency or they need some help with. And because of that, in the US we end up with much higher productivity than over in many European countries or many other highly industrialized countries. And finally, workers in the US tend to enter the labor force earlier than in other countries. They retire later, and they have fewer long spells of unemployment than workers in Europe. Not only is our labor market more flexible, but our financial system is more efficient than in other countries. Because technological change is essential for rapid productivity growth, firms need to obtain funds in order to implement these new technologies. And when firms need additional funding, they turn to the financial system to get that money. So it is important that funds for investment not only be available for firms, but also be allocated efficiently, so to the firms that need them the most, and the firms that can earn the highest level of profit from them, rather than firms that are going to waste them on far less necessary or things that are going to meet consumer needs worse. Smaller firms that are unable to issue stocks and bonds are often able to obtain funding from banks. And entrepreneurs that found new firms, often called startups, generally find that investors are unwilling to buy their stocks and bonds because their firms lack records of profitability, because there's a much higher level of risk, because investors don't know as much about those firms. Banks are also fairly reluctant to lend to these new firms founded to introduce new and unfamiliar technologies, again because this is a high risk for them. But in the United States, these technology startups are able to obtain funds from venture capital firms. What these venture capital firms do is raise funds from institutional investors, so like pension funds and wealthy individuals. The owner of these venture capital firms closely examine the business plans of startup firms, digging deep into what they plan on doing and what consumer needs are trying to meet and what new technologies they have. And they're looking for those that are most likely to succeed, and they'll invest in those that they think have a high chance of success. Now, in exchange for providing funding to these startups, venture capital firm often becomes part owner of the startup and may even have a role managing the firm to ensure their profitability. A successful venture capital firm is able to attract investors who would not otherwise be willing to provide funds for startups because the investors lack enough information about the startup. Imagine yourself, if you have a large amount of savings you'd like to invest in a firm that could revolutionize the world, odds are you don't have the in-depth knowledge to know whether their business plan is good or whether their technology is feasible. And if you had that much knowledge about how good it would be, you would probably somehow be involved in the industry yourself already. So a number of well-known US high technology firms, think like Google, relied on venture capital firms to fund their early expansion because so many people lacked the knowledge to know if it was a good investment or not. So because we have these venture capital firms in the United States that are willing and able to finance technology-driven startups, the US has an advantage in bringing new products and new processes to the market that we don't see in other countries who lack these types of firms and these avenues for funding. The economic growth model predicts that countries that were very poor in 1960 should have grown rapidly over the next 50 years. And as we saw, some did, but a lot of them did not. So why are many low-income countries growing so slowly? Now, there's no single answer because a lot has to go right. Most economists point to 4 key factors. The first is failure to enforce the rule of law. The next is wars and revolution. Next is poor public education and poor public health. And finally, low rates of savings and investment. So we're going to turn and look at each of these over the next few slides. Well, the first is failure to enforce the rule of law. And remember, for Douglas North, the rule of law, sound property rights, were essential for Britain starting the Industrial Revolution. Now, the rule of law refers to the ability of a government to enforce the laws of the country, and particularly with respect to protecting private property and enforcing contracts. For entrepreneurs in a market economy to succeed, the government must guarantee property rights. And by property rights, we mean the rights of individuals or firms to have the exclusive use of their property, and that includes the right to buy or sell it. Otherwise, we're not going to see entrepreneurs be willing to risk starting a business. You also need functioning independent court systems. So many people consider China the great economic growth success story, myself included. The decision by the Chinese government leaders in the 1970s, after the reign of Mao Zedong, their decision to turn away from centrally planned economy towards more of a market system, not completely a market system, but more of a market system, and they allowed market forces to have some role in decision making. This unleashed economic growth that had lifted more than 1 billion people in China out of poverty. So while the Chinese government economy still faces significant obstacles to maintaining high growth rates, and the Chinese Communist Party has maintained quite a bit of rule over the economy and a lot of control and central planning relative to other market economies like the United States, there still have been an incredible success and continue to grow. So some U.S. firms have chosen in recent years to locate their factories and other facilities in Mexico rather than China. And that's because Mexico is closer to the U.S. and because labor costs have been increasing much more rapidly in China. So this may be good for the Mexican economy because it's increased overall factory employment and the country has easier access to U.S. technology, so it makes it easier to adopt that. But the growth rate of the Mexican economy has been incredibly disappointing, despite this increase in investment from the United States and increase in technology from the U.S. being used in Mexico. So this graph here on the right compares the growth rates of real GDP per capita for the Mexican and Chinese economies over the past 35 years. And as we see, China's growth is much higher than the growth we see in Mexico. So what explains this difference? What's going on in Mexico that's causing the slow growth? So for most of the period in Mexican history, from 1910 till 2000, the Institutional Revolutionary Party dominated the Mexican government. Now, for decades, what the party followed was limiting imports and foreign investments and concentrating on building up domestic industries behind high tariff walls. The Mexican government also took over, or what we call nationalized, important businesses, including the entire oil industry. So while we'd expect Mexico to see some of this growth that China has experienced, Mexico still has problems. They suffer from a corrupt government, they have weak rule of law, and a poor court system that discourages financial contracting. So much more difficult to get financing to even start these businesses or to expand an existing business. Now, Mexico's GDP per capita remains ahead of China. It's been ahead of China the entire time. Seems like it will not be long until China ends up with a higher per capita GDP than Mexico does. Remember, China has the second largest economy in the world currently. They're on pace to become the largest economy in the world fairly soon. So we can see the problems that Mexico has. Having a corrupt government, not having a strong rule of law or an independent court system, discouraging financial innovation. How these can hold down growth, even when other things like foreign investment and the use of foreign technologies in the country should reverberate through the economy and help lead to long run growth and to improving the standard of living for the people in the country. An additional reason for lack of growth in poor countries is wars and revolution. So wars and revolution make investment and technological growth difficult. It makes people less likely to invest, to loan to businesses. It makes businesses less likely to take out a loan to expand their production when there's this high risk of having it being destroyed or your property expropriated. So for example, Mozambique had almost 2 decades of civil war in the 70s and the 80s, and they ended up with declining real GDP per capita. When the civil wars ended, it experienced renewed growth, 3.7% per year, from 1990 to 2019. So these are fairly large increases in living standards in almost 2 decades after the end of the Civil War. Next is poor public education and poor public health. So workers are less productive when they have lower levels of education. They have less human capital. It makes it harder for them to have the expertise and have the technical knowledge to come up with new methods of production or to adopt these new technologies. Because at a certain point, you need a certain level of background knowledge, a certain amount of knowledge, in order to be able to use more advanced technologies. And another is poor health care and poor public health, which also makes workers less productive. People who are sick, they end up working less, and when they do work, they're less productive. And poor nutrition or exposure to certain diseases in childhood can leave people permanently weakened and affect their intelligence as adults. So poor public health has a significant negative effect on the human capital of workers in developing countries. And this is something we saw in Europe before the Industrial Revolution, even during the Industrial Revolution, is poor public health reducing the living standards in the country, reducing their ability to build human capital and to increase the standard of living. And finally, there's low rates of savings and investment. So to invest into factories, machineries, computers, firms need funds. Some of the funds can come from the owners of the firm and from their friends and family, but a lot of firms raise most of their funds from bank loans and the sales of stocks and bonds in the financial markets. Now, in most developing countries, stock and bond markets don't exist, and the banking system is very weak. The low saving rates in these developing countries can contribute to what's called a vicious cycle of poverty. Because households have low incomes, they save very little. Because households save very little, few funds are available for firms to borrow. Because these firms lack funds, they don't invest in new factories, machineries, and equipment needed for economic growth. Because the economy doesn't grow, households remain poor. Their incomes remain low, and their savings remain low, and the whole process begins again. One way for a developing country to break out of the vicious cycle of low savings and investment is through foreign investment. These are some of the benefits of globalization. So you can have foreign direct investment. So that's when a firm from one country purchases a building or a facility in a foreign country and runs it. There's also foreign portfolio investment. So an individual or a firm will purchase stocks or bonds issued in another country. So this foreign investment can help take the place of insufficient domestic investment. If there's a low savings rate in the country, if there's a poor financial system in the country, instead of relying just on people that live in that nation, you can get investment from outside the country to help provide the funds for firms to expand their offerings, to build a larger factory, to produce more goods, to invest in research and development, to offer more types of goods. Now we'll begin the final section, growth policies. So we'll briefly touch on government policies that help foster economic growth. So now we can summarize the types of policies that are essential to fostering economic growth. So first is enhancing property rights and the rule of law. A market system cannot work at all. It cannot function unless property rights are being enforced. Entrepreneurs are unlikely to risk their own funds, and investors are unlikely to lend their funds to entrepreneurs if the property is not protected from being arbitrarily seized. In many developing countries, the rule of law and property rights are undermined by government corruption. And in some developing countries, it's impossible for an entrepreneur to obtain a permit to start a business without first paying bribes, often to several different government officials and different bureaus. And this isn't just what we see today in less developed countries. The threat of expropriation of your property or of your money leads to people saving it in weird ways. I always thought that buried treasure was just something from, like TV shows or maybe like old tales of where pirates would hide what they stole. But in The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith mentions that the amount of buried treasure in England from all the lesser feudal lords not wanting to have their money taken by the monarch was enough to pay off the national debt of England over a couple of years. So this was something we saw in England, of people trying to hide their money so that way it couldn't be taken by the monarch. Just highlighting, instead of actually using that, investing it in a business, expanding, being able to start a business or to expand your business so that you can make more money and end up providing more things for people to help improve their lives, they end up just burying gold and hiding it. Next is improving health and education. Recently, more and more economists are becoming convinced that poor health is a major impediment to growth in some countries. So Robert Fogel's research emphasized the importance of interaction between health and economic growth. As people's health improves, they become stronger and less susceptible to diseases, and they become more productive. So we've seen a lot of work in developing countries trying to increase vaccination rates and doing things like, in places where malaria is a problem, giving people nets to put over their bed so they're not being bit up by mosquitoes and getting malaria at night. Another thing that improving the health and education of a country can do is reduce what's called brain drain, where the highly educated and the smartest people in a country leave the developing country for high-income countries. So this migration is going to occur when successful individuals or intelligent individuals that know they're going to have success in the future believe that economic opportunities are very limited in their country, but they're much better in other countries. Next is policies that promote technological change. So one of the lessons from the solo growth model, this model of economic growth we've worked with, is that technological change is more important than increases in capital and explaining long-run growth. So when we have government policies that facilitate access to technology, these are crucial for low-income countries. And the easiest way for a developing country to gain access to technology is first through foreign direct investment, so where foreign firms are allowed to build new facilities or to buy domestic firms. So recent economic growth in India has been greatly aided by the Indian government's relaxation of regulations on foreign investment. So it's made it possible for India to gain access to technology from these large multinational corporations with great technology like Dell or Microsoft. And once they begin opening these factories through foreign direct investment, people that work there begin building their skills. They become used to working with technology, and they can leave and start their own firm working with that or their own production facility. Next is policies that promote saving and investment. So one important thing is eliminating corruption so that people know their assets won't be seized. They can trust the assets of the company won't be seized, so the investment in the company is secure, and that their gains won't be seized or won't be suddenly taxed. So again, they know that their investment itself, the money they make off that investment, is going to be secure. Now once this is done, governments can do other things to encourage saving and investment. So they can use things like tax incentives. So tax-deferred savings plans or investment tax credits, different types of IRAs, or retirement funds like 401k or 403bs. By encouraging people to save, that's going to promote investment. It'll allow firms to have access to funds that allow them to expand their output, whether it's purchasing new capital or whether it's adopting new technologies that help improve worker productivity, and which in turn helps improve the standard of living of everyone living in that society. So the central assumption of this chapter is that economic growth is beneficial for citizens. This seems fairly straightforward and fairly difficult to argue for low-income countries. But some people maintain that further economic growth may not be desirable in high-income countries. So some argue that there's negative effects on the environment from economic growth, although the so-called Kuznets environmental curve, basically a curve that shows as countries become richer, first they make the environment worse, then once they reach a certain level of income, they're now comfortable enough that they can care about the environment, and the destruction of the environment decreases. So pollution, these sorts of things decrease once countries reach a certain level of income. Next is the depletion of natural resources, which may be a concern for some, but as now I'm blanking on the economist that bet with Paul Ehrlich, who said that we were going to run out of resources back in the 90s. The price of resources have gone down. We've actually been able to find more and more resources. So we're nowhere near running out of natural resources. And finally, the last argument against growth is the diminishment of distinctive cultures. That as countries grow and get involved with each other and connected through international trade, we end up removing a lot of the differences between us, and we end these cultural differences. Many of these arguments against growth tend to be normative, so economic analysis can contribute to the debate. We can show the costs and the benefits of certain things, but we can't settle the issue and say that economic growth is more important than maintaining your culture.